Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Josefina Echavarría. I am the director of the Peace Accords Matrix, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this webinar in which we are launching the fourth report on implementation by the Kroc Institute on how is that implementation of the Peace Accord going in Colombia. A little bit about our methodology for our report today. I am accompanied today by Elise Ditta, one of our research associates, Daniel Cano, who is our political coordinator, and Kyle Johnson, who is the coordinator of reports at the Barometer initiative in Colombia. The Kroc Institute has a very special role in the monitoring of the implementation of the Peace Accord. In Chapter 6 of the Peace Accord signed in 2016 between the Colombian government and the FARC-EP guerrillas, we were given the role of doing the technical support of the follow-up of the implementation. This role requires us to look at the whole implementation of the agreement, looking at not only specific parts or chapters of the accord, but the whole of it and how it has been implemented by different agencies, not only the government, in relation to what had originally been agreed in 2016. For this, we created a special methodology based on the Peace Accords Matrix methodology, in which we follow more than 30 agreements around the world from 1989 to 2012. We developed this methodology that covers 578 commitments that can be observed and verified and measured. And we provide information not only to the Commission on verification and follow-up of the implementation in Colombia, but we also provide information on a real-time basis to the Secretary of the International Component of Verification. We also have these opportunities in which we are able to engage with our academic audience and with a much larger global academic audience and public policy initiative, in which what we do is we try to share with all of you how is that implementation going, what are the advances, what are maybe the obstacles, what are the challenges that are ahead, but also very important, what are those opportunities that we can take advantage of in order to strengthen the implementation of the Peace Accord. We will start our webinar today by taking a look at a very short video, 4.5 minutes, prepared by our communication team, in which we show the key messages of what is contained on the fourth report of implementation toward territorial transformation. And then we will have panelists responding to some questions, and we will try to make this as interactive as possible. Please, if I may ask our communications team to play the video. Thank you.
More than 3 years have passed since the signing of the final peace agreement. Now Colombia begins a new phase of implementation, territorial transformation. The Kroc Institute's fourth report analyses data collected between December 2018 and November 2019 and confirms this transition to a new phase of implementation. The report's quantitative and qualitative analysis of all 578 commitments in the 2016 Accord indicates that most short-term goals have been achieved and the institutions created to support implementation of the agreement are in operation. For example, the territorial development plans were included in the National Development Plan. The creation of a multi-purpose cadastre is progressing, 528 territorial peace councils have emerged, and the process for reincorporation of ex-combatants was approved and is also moving forward. The data shows that implementation continued during the report time period, but at a slower rate than in previous years. This is due in part to the fact that medium-term goals require more time to achieve, and also because of delays in necessary regulatory reforms. These factors could affect the fulfilment of long-term goals and the sustainability of peace in the country. Colombia's peace agreement is comprehensive. The commitments within it go beyond the laying down of arms and the reincorporation of ex-combatants and seek to solve the underlying causes of the armed conflict. 88% of the commitments in the agreement focus on reforms and social programmes. In order to achieve these commitments, more time and resources need to be invested, and other commitments within the agreement also need to be fulfilled in advance. Therefore, any delays or partial advances related to specific issues such as comprehensive rural reform, political reform, the approval of ex-combatants' productive projects impacts the overall implementation of the agreement. Immediate challenges include finalising short-term commitments, like completing 11 of the 16 national plans for comprehensive rural reform, and prioritising and mainstreaming the agreement's gender and ethnic approaches, so that it progress at the same rate as other provisions within the agreement. All of these efforts will make it possible to build firm foundations for territorial transformation and sustainable peace in the future.
Immediate challenges include finalising short-term commitments, like completing 11 of the 16 national plans for comprehensive rural reform and prioritising and mainstreaming the agreement's gender and ethnic approaches so they progress at the same rate as other provisions within the agreement.
Hello. I think we're having...
In accordance with the central purpose of the agreement, protecting the leadership and participation of women and members of ethnic communities will contribute to the state regaining legitimacy and complying with required reparations for victims of the armed conflict. The success of the territorial approach and implementation will depend largely on citizen participation through efforts such as the territorial development plans and the territorial councils for peace and reconciliation. The Kroc Institute's fourth report also emphasises the need to strengthen the articulation agreements between implementation agencies and prioritise commitments that promote democracy, including the special transitory voting districts for peace and other political reforms. Through comparative study of other comprehensive peace agreements around the world, the report emphasises that robust implementation reduces the risk of the emergence of dissident armed groups and that public support for the peace agreement tends to increase when implementation is perceived to be progressing. Implementation of the final agreement is progressing, but the road ahead is long. This road leads to true territorial transformation and a process that all Colombians must take part in.
It seems that we're having an issue with Josefina's microphone.
All right, so I think we can jump right in to the presentation of some of the findings and some of the discussion about the report overall. And so I think one of the first things that we would like to discuss and look into are some of the key messages, some of those messages that were in the video, but we would really like to highlight in terms of what we found in the last year as we looked at the implementation of the peace agreement. I don't know, Daniel, if you'd please start and describe some of these key messages. So we can start with the content of the report itself.
Sure. There are 5 key messages that we want to highlight in this report. We consider very relevant in terms of the analysis, more the qualitative analysis that we want to emphasize in this 4th report. The first message has to do with that the implementation is reaching a crucial point of transformation. And this crucial point has to do with the important change in the nature of the commitments that has started implemented. We've partially finished with the short-term commitments, and now we're going through the more long-term commitments that require more time and more efforts in order to be achieved. And that's gonna have an impact or an effect in the speed of the implementation. And this message is also related with the second message, which is one of the aspects that we want to emphasize also in this report, that is the importance of increasing the effective participation of civil society in order to increase confidence and legitimacy on the process. And this is something that you're gonna see all over the report in the different points. And it is crucial in order also to strengthening what we mentioned in the third message that has to do with the revitalization or invigoration of the gender and ethnic focuses. And also the territorial focus, which is key, because now, as I mentioned, we're going through more territorial implementation. And in that sense, participation of these most affected communities or groups, which are women organization and also ethnic groups, requires a higher level of participation in the implementation at the territorial level. And there is a 4th message that has to do with the implementation framework plan, which is the methodology that the government used in order to measure how the implementation is working. And we emphasize here the importance of updating some of the indicators that they are using, because as you're gonna see during this presentation, the first period of implementation of this indicator, although there has been some progress, there are some indicators that hasn't been completed and need to be updated. And our recommendation is that this update, the updated process of these indicators occurs within the CCV, which is the space where FARC and government can discuss jointly how to update these indicators. And finally, we want to emphasize the importance of the agreement comprehensiveness as one of the keys for its successful implementation. So these are the 5 key messages that we want to highlight and emphasize in this report.
Thank you, Daniel, very much. I'm very sorry that I had to leave you for a few seconds, but my internet connection decided to take a little break. Elise, you are one of our associate directors and researchers of PAM, and I was wondering if you could shed some light about how the Barometer is actually gathering information to track implementation, and what are the quantitative and the qualitative methodologies of that we're using in the report. Thank you.
Certainly. I think knowing a little bit of that methodological background will help us understand better the findings of the report. So I'm happy to share. When we started tracking implementation after the signing of the peace agreement in 2016, our teams read the agreement closely and chose and picked out 578 commitments, or stipulations we call them, which are observable and measurable items that must be completed according to the peace agreement. These 578 commitments were validated with the FARC and with the government so that we could all come to an agreement on what we would be measuring, more or less. And then on a monthly basis, our team in Colombia gathers information on of those 578 commitments. As you can see here in the presentation, they have looked at more than 1,500 reports from 176 different organizations in the last year. We've looked at 590 articles from 57 media sources, and we've done interviews with more than 100 key allies. Then, like I said, after that information has been uploaded to our database on a monthly basis, we use it to quantitatively code or score progress in implementation. So we do that on a scale of 0 to 3. 0 means implementation hasn't started. 1 is implementation has been initiated. 2, implementation is going on and is viable to be completed. And 3, the implementation of the commitment has been completed. Something innovative about our methodology for this scoring process is that it's extremely collaborative. We do a proposal for that coding on a monthly basis here at Notre Dame, but then all of that information is reviewed by our team in Colombia to ensure that it's as accurate as possible in real time.
Thank you very much. Kyle, I wonder if we could go a bit deeper into the way that the data is used for the method of the report. How can we gather that data, and how have you been able to use it in the current text?
The quantitative data that Elise just described, the whole process, is kind of a starting point for the different analyses within the text. The analyses, though, are qualitative. So the qualitative is kind of the second piece to the puzzle, in which the different specialists on each point of the agreement that work at the Barometer tells what all this data means and paints the picture behind the numbers, a bit of what is going well, what perhaps has not gone well, what opportunities are there to improve implementation and kind of improve the data that we see here. And that process that's where the interviews and all the other work that they do on a regular basis comes into play, because their knowledge of how things are going mixed with this data gives us an overall picture of how things are going point by point through the agreement and with some other aspects of the peace implementation process. So the idea is they write and give this analysis, and then, as Elise mentioned, this also becomes kind of an internal discussion within the Barometer and within Kroc, where their knowledge and expertise comes together with editors and different readers and different people, and collectively we end up with both a quantitative and qualitative analysis that gives an overall image of not only where peace implementation is now, but the trends that have been occurring over the last few years and where things could go in the future.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, precisely following those 578 commitment or stipulations, how has the implementation progressed in the year 2019?
Yeah, so there's two elements to this to look at how implementation has gone in 2019. So overall, what we describe or what we analyze in the report is a 6% difference of progress in implementation in 2019. And so what that means is when we add up the different percentages you see in this graph, so the 25%, which is the completed parts of the agreement, the 15 intermediate, and 34% of the commitments that are at a minimum level of implementation, when we add those up, we get a total of 74%. So that 74% kind of describes anything where progress has been made on the peace process, even if that progress is minimum, like has occurred in 34% of the peace agreement. When we compare that total, the 74%, to the same total from the same process at the end of 2018, or at the end of November 2018, that total was 68%. So when we compare the two numbers, the difference is 6%. So that 6% describes any 6% of the peace agreement that has made any progress in the last year, whether it's gone from not initiated to minimum or even intermediate to complete. It's an overall image, but when you open up the numbers and you see the different levels, that's where you get an even more complete image of what those overall general statistics mean.
Thank you. Daniel, we have heard about this general and oral progress of implementation of 6%. Can you go a little bit deeper into each of these points? How has each of the points and the transversal approaches progressed during the year 2019?
Of course, and I will start by the transversal approaches, especially the ethnic and gender approaches. And as I mentioned, they are not just important, but crucial for the implementation. And we have seen some progress in these two areas, and the main aspects in that progress has to do with the coordination of the comprehensive system for truth, justice, and reparation in order to include these organizations of women and also ethnic groups in their methodologies. And that's something that has boosted the implementation in point 5. However, we continue to see important challenges, and probably the most relevant is the increased level of violence against women and ethnic leaders at the territorial level, which is one of the main warnings that we are presenting in this report. In terms of the point 1, which is the rural reform, we highlighted that the multi-purpose cadastre and also the territorial development plans has been the main priority for the government during this period. And you can reflect that prioritization in the advances that we present here, especially that the territorial development plan has been included within the national plan, and also the multi-purpose cadastre has been included also in the national plan as a basic public service, which is something that is gonna boost this land registry mechanism in Colombia, which is very important. In terms of the challenges that we have seen in point 1, the most relevant is the limited progress in terms of the enhancement of the 16 national plans for rural reform. We're still missing 11 of those plans, and that they should be adapted in 2018. And this is important because this might generate what we call negative cascades, because if we don't advance with these rural national plans, they're gonna generate delays on further commitments that are coming in the next periods. In terms of the point 2, which is political participation, we emphasize the importance of this point because although it doesn't require too much investment in terms of resources, it's a point that is lagging behind in general terms compared with the other points of the agreement. And it's something that we emphasize because we have seen some progress related to, for example, very technical aspects like electoral participation campaigns, and also the calls for awarding community broadcasters. However, critical aspects, the more transformational aspects in this point, which are, for example, the different laws to open the democratic participation in Colombia, like the law for electoral participation reform, there hasn't had progress. And this is something that is creating a bottleneck in this point that need to be addressed, because if we can do that, it's gonna be like a very important victory to boost this point. Related to point 3, which is end of conflict, we, as you saw in the previous presentation, point 3 is one of the points that has had the biggest process in the previous year, because most of the stipulations were related to short time measures like initial disarmament process and initial reincorporation. And this year, what we have seen is that there has been progress due to the commitment of former combatants, but also the efforts of the government and the support of the international community. But in this point, we see the biggest threat to the implementation, which is the issue of security of former combatants. And we highlight that there has been progress in terms of approving, for example, economic projects for individual and collective actions for reincorporation. However, 2019 was the deadliest year for former combatants since the signing of the peace agreement in 2016. So this is something that needs to be addressed and is related with the next part of the analysis. We try to consolidate the analysis of the security guarantees which are split in mostly the whole agreement, but basically in point 2 and point 3 in this section here. And what we have identified during the analysis is that the implementation of the security guarantees has had some progress, but that progress has been fragmented and disjointed. And with another important aspect is that there has been very low participation from civil society in the creation of these security guarantees. And that's important because, as you can see, aspects, for example, like a special investigation unit in coordination with the lead corps, they have reached some progress in terms of investigation of the cases of murders of social leaders, but the phenomena continue affecting social leaders and former combatants. So we've seen that although there has been progress in terms of investigation, there has not too much progress in terms of dismantling of criminal organization, and also in the implementation of more broad comprehensive programs for protection of communities and organizations in the territories, which is one of the important challenges in this aspect. In point 4, which is the solution of the problem of illicit drugs, we also identify some progress related especially to the continuation of the substitution of illicit crops program, and also the increase in terms of families that have received technical assistance and initial nutrition security projects. However, the delays in the implementation of the program, combined with the violence against communities participating in this program, has affected the trust of the community in the government, and also in the effectiveness of the program as a whole, which is one of the main challenges that we identify. And getting to the point 5, as Kyle mentioned, we identify here an important progress, and mostly related to this autonomy of the integral system, and also the participation and the contribution of the international community, supporting and funding most of the initiatives of the different entities of the system. And this is also important because what they did has mainly focused in terms of promoting and improving participation of these more marginalized groups. So by promoting participation of women organizations at ethnic groups, they have achieved an important progress. And we jump from 11% of commitments completed in 2018 to 21% of commitments fully completed in 2019, which is the biggest increase in terms of percentage in this report. Although we can continue seeing some challenges, especially which is what are related specifically to the articulation between this system that has been a product of the peace agreement with the previous system that continue working from the previous victims law. And this is important also because the victims law need to be updated in order to facilitate the articulation between these mechanisms. And finally, in point 6, which has to do with the different mechanisms for verification and overseeing of the implementation, we identify important advances, especially that the different instances or entities for overseeing continue in place. The SSCV, which is this instance where FARC and government works together, it has been extended for one more year. And also there has been a revitalization of this high level instance for ethnic peoples. The participation of the international community has been very important, specifically with the different funds that they have in order to finance the initiatives for the implementation, and also the participation of the private sector with an important figure in terms of resources due to the tax fair works, that is an initiative that the government has promoted between the private sector. In terms of the main challenges here, has to do with the low progress or little progress in terms of the implementation of critical laws, specifically in point 1, point 2, and point 4, that are needed in order to move forward in terms of the implementation.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful. I think that this gives us an overall understanding of how in each of those points, and especially in terms of the intersectional approaches to peace implementation, what are the main advances and the main challenges. Now, I would like to ask Kyle, if we were looking for these low-hanging fruits, what are the biggest opportunities that we find based on report 4 of the Kroc Institute to strengthen the implementation of the peace accord in Colombia?
Of course, I think before going into kind of these general opportunities of low-hanging fruit, when you read the report, each point has its own opportunities, its own fruit, shall we say, that are much more in detail and are quite useful. But generally, I think the first one is moving forward with laws and decrees that come from point 2. As Danielle mentioned, the democratic reform side of things, the structural reforms of Colombia's democracy, you have to go through laws, most of them. And most of these laws have not made progress or simply have not been approved as of the end of 2019 and as of now, right, as well. And so one of the key ones, because it doesn't really require any big financial resources, moving these laws forward would be a huge step forward, but it involves the government and Congress as well. The second one is when we talk about revitalizing the ethnic and gender focuses, there's a key emphasis on points 1 and 4. In part because points 1 and 4 are long-term and contain a lot of the gender stipulations, but also they're territorial. And so women and ethnic groups were disproportionately affected by the conflict. And so that's why they have such an important role in the peace agreement. And so when we look at those parts of the agreement, points 1 and 4, that address the roots of the conflict and the structural issues that kind of fed the conflict over the years, ethnic and gender have to be at the forefront of those points as they move forward. I also believe that the territorial peace councils can be strengthened. As we saw in the video, over 500 were recently created, but they still have a lot of progress to make sure that their functioning is sustainable. They can continue to work and towards help build peace and be a space for discussion about peace on a local level. And this includes the coordination with the National Peace Council as well. So those territorial peace councils, really the heart of moving them forward and making them sustainable is financial and technical support as well. The fourth low-hanging fruit, even though this is difficult, is completing the illicit crop substitution program and understanding it as part of a larger anti-drug policy and not just a piece of the peace agreement that should be fulfilled either way. This is extremely important because it's not only about the transition from illicit to legal crops in different parts of Colombia, it's also about building trust and a solid, legitimate relationship between these communities affected by conflict as well and the Colombian state, that the government can show them that they can work together with these communities to move them forward and improve their chances at illicit development. And finally, we think that strengthening the capacities of the Special Investigation Unit in the Attorney General's Office, the elite corps of the police and UNIPEP is essential as well. As Danielle mentioned, they have made progress in terms of investigations of who is killing ex-combatants, who is killing social leaders, and that they are able to establish a good amount of the time, a little over half the time, who was the trigger person, who was the person who actually carried out the killing. Where they need more support and would make great strides forward is identifying who's the intellectual author behind that killing. And so that's why, given the importance of social leaders, given the importance of security for ex-combatants and for leaders, strengthening the capacities of these different entities to define or to investigate and find out who is actually ordering these killings would be essential and would help implementation move forward quite drastically.
Very well. Elise, you were mentioning before that there are different types of teams. There are teams in Colombia, in the capital, in the territories. There are teams in South Bend. How do you bring together these different parts of the information in the territorial methodology? And how do you think that type of information is enriching in the quantitative analysis of the PAM matrix?
I think as both Daniel and Kyle have mentioned, as we were moving into this third year of implementation itself has been moving from the capital city, from creation of laws and programs to areas around Colombia that have been most affected by the armed conflict. So with that transition in terms of content of the accord, we've also had to transition some of our monitoring of implementation to the areas most affected by the armed conflict. So we work with a team of territorial representatives who are spread out across the 16 PEDET or Territorial Development Plan regions, which were highly affected by the armed conflict. And they do research at the local level with focus groups, with interviews with local government, local civil society. They attend local events, all in order to give us a better picture of what's happening at the local level. Colombia is a very big country, and as Kyle was saying, the conflict has affected different population groups in different regions in different ways. So this type of local information is key to nuance any quantitative information that is being produced at the local level, sorry, at the national level.
Thank you very much, Elise. I think we've been able to cover a lot of the main aspects, the main messages of the report but also a greater part of how do we not only construct a methodology, but how are we able to follow up on that information in an independent way. And entering a little bit more the questions of the public, Elise, may I ask you, so how is COVID-19 not only affecting implementation of the peace accord, but how is that actually affecting the way that we're monitoring the implementation of the peace accord?
Sure, I'll talk about your second question first. In terms of our monitoring of the accord, Colombia has relatively strict rules regarding movement of people and meetings related to COVID. So our movement around the country and even in Bogota has been very limited by the COVID pandemic, which has required us, like peace builders and people around the world, to become creative in the way that we monitor implementation. This involves a lot of digital meetings. People are still doing work. It's just in a different way. Also thinking about other creative ways of communicating with people who maybe don't have a stable internet connection. So what monitoring can we do by WhatsApp or through phone calls and other ways of trying to maintain a little bit of that momentum for monitoring implementation. In terms of how COVID is affecting implementation, that's a topic that we've been discussing a lot with our team, and we've come to kind of 4 big conclusions about ways that we see implementation related to COVID. The first and perhaps most important is that the COVID pandemic highlights different structural inequalities that we're trying to be that the writers of the peace agreement were trying to address. So these are things like lack of government services in rural areas, high levels of inequality. These kind of things are made worse sometimes by the COVID epidemic, and also are tried to be solved in the peace agreement. So that's a strong call to continue implementation, because by implementing, we can also deal with some of those effects of the COVID epidemic. So that's the first one. Second, at a very practical level, the restrictions caused by COVID have made some delays in implementation. So a very practical case, the Truth Commission has a mandate of 3 years, and the commission is supposed to collect testimonies across Colombia about what has occurred during the armed conflict. Obviously, their teams can't move around the Colombian territory at the moment, so they're seeing their work delayed, which is a concern, particularly considering their short mandate. Third, and this is a kind of a developing theme that we don't really have answers about, but we'll be watching it in the future, is related to budget and legislative authorities, legislative priorities, I'm sorry. So in terms of budget, we know that both international organizations and the Colombian government have had to divert some funding to deal with COVID issues. We don't know what that will mean for next budget year in terms of funding for the Colombian Peace Agreement, both international and government funding. Another important thing to note that is a large part of the infrastructure projects created within the Accord are funded by natural resource royalty funds. So the fact that the price of petroleum has decreased also means there's fewer funds for those kind of infrastructure projects. And then on the legislative agenda side of things, the Colombian Congress has gone virtual, which slows things down. And there's concerns about those laws that Kai was mentioning in point 2 that still need to be approved in terms of special voting districts for victims, electoral reform, etc. And then finally, a reiterated concern that we've shared before is it's kind of too early to tell exactly the numbers, but it seems like there's a continued or even increase in the number of murders of social leaders and ex-combatants during this time, perhaps related to a decrease in government presence in these areas. So that's definitely an alert that we raise during this time to assure that protection measures, both collective and individual, are continued during this time of quarantine.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask Kyle, how can campesinos be involved in implementation when they continue to be threatened by remaining paramilitaries and government agents, as I am hearing about from groups such as Christian peacemakers?
Yeah, that is the kind of million-dollar question. The threats continue from all around, whether it be what some people call paramilitaries or different armed groups throughout the country. But I think there's two kind of key steps that can be taken. And one is better implementing those protection mechanisms. Danielle touched on this very quickly. This Decree 660, which talks a lot about protection in rural context, collective protection mechanisms, and different ways to protect campesinos, indigenous leaders, women, whoever may be participating in kind of promoting aspects of the peace agreement on a local level. Those mechanisms exist, and some of them are in the agreement, and so their implementation is essential. At the same time, I think the key is also getting that participation up and getting those participation mechanisms working as well as we can in the future, because that's also where the legitimacy of their work comes into play as well. That's where you can kind of, it doesn't remove the threats, but it raises the cost of killing those people. It raises the positive image of the work that they are doing on a local level. This is a long-term issue as well, though. So there is no one simple solution, but I think those two would be great steps moving forward to try to help protect some of these people. And when you talk to a lot of campesino or other leaders, this is what they mention as well. Finding protection mechanisms that respond to their context, whether they be an indigenous tribe or whomever, or Afro-Colombian peoples as well, and making sure that that participation is a positive space for them and is not a space that causes them problems in the future.
You were mentioning, Kyle, some part of the legitimacy of the process. We have another question, Danielle. Why does enhancing civil society's role improve the legitimacy of the process? Any examples you could offer of how this has supported the Colombian process in the past?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, I lost my connection. I have to connect through the cell phone. But yeah, of course, there is a clear example of it, which is, for example, the rural development plans. During the process of the approval of these plans, participatory mechanisms allow more than 200,000 people to participate in this process. And that generates an important level of legitimacy in terms of how government interact with civil society. And that process increase the level of confidence and start allowing people to believe that implementation is going to help them actually with their real needs. So that is a clear example of how the implementation of these mechanisms provide a space for the increase of state legitimacy among civil society. However, that process that started at the beginning that started and then approved these plans, these development plans, need to be continued with the same level of participation. Otherwise, that first step that the state gain in terms of confidence with population on the civil society, it might be lost. So those are the things that we are emphasizing in terms of strengthening those mechanisms that are in place due to the peace agreement in order to facilitate people to experience and to actually believe that their participation is effective. It's not just assisting to the meetings, but also having the possibility to make decisions. And that is a crucial aspect for this phase that is already starting in the territories in Colombia. The roadmap for the implementation of these plans is something that is just started at the end of last year, and is something that is going to require a lot of this effort in terms of including different groups and different organizations nationwide for these mechanisms in order to be more effective. And also, it is important that the more transformative process within the PEDETs are beginning, because we are focusing just in these small infrastructure works, and people need to see more robust transformation. And of course, these need to be hand by hand with the security aspects that allow people to feel that the government have the capacity to protect them also. And that's, I think, one of the things that I want to highlight.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, just let me ask you a follow-up question that we also have here in the Q&A, and is, can you tell us more about those challenges to reintegration of the ex-combatants?
Sure. Well, of course, the issue of security is the main challenge here. And this has to do also with the important change in terms of the new geography of reincorporation. Most of the former combatants, at least 80% of them, are not living within the old ETCRs, which were those territorial and capacitation spaces where they were confined at the beginning. So now 80% of them are living all around the country in more than 500 municipalities. So this situation requires an important change in terms of how protection and how reincorporation mechanisms operate. And we know that the government, for example, approved the new reincorporation route that is going to serve in terms of solving some of these issues, but they require a specific mechanisms for protection in the new reincorporation areas. For example, expanding the mandate of the UNIPEP, which is this special police for protecting the former combatants, with other projects that they implement. For example, those projects that are aimed for transformation of conflicts or gender-based violence, and other aspects that support not just security, but also coexistence between the former combatants and the communities in the territories that they are living. So this is an important challenge, and also the issue of land for their productive projects. Most of the projects for former combatants are focused on agriculture and rural projects, and that requires land. This wasn't part of the agreement, but it's something that they need to work together in order to solve this issue, how to find the different spaces for develop their economic projects.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Elise, what are the steps on ensuring that ethnic groups, mainly women in rural areas affected by conflict, are included on the implementation of peace, that they're benefiting from it?
Yeah. So both for the ethnic approach to the peace agreement and the gender approach, we see a delay in the implementation of those commitments related to the implementation of general commitments. So we see about a 14% delay in terms of the implementation of gender commitments and an 11% delay in the implementation of ethnic commitments. So it's certainly a concern. There's a few different areas that are particularly important to highlight. The first is a lot of both the gender and ethnic commitments are long-term. They are related to crop substitution, to rural development. So we wouldn't expect them necessarily to be completed yet, but there are very important steps that need to be taken now to assure that they can be completed in the long term. So I'll mention a few. One important one is that ethnic and gender considerations are included in the plans, programs, laws that are created in the Accord. So a good example is a law for differential treatment for coca growers that hasn't yet been passed, but when it is passed, it'll be very important to include a gender approach in that law, for example. So first, kind of in the laws and norms, it's important to include the gender and ethnic approach. And then in the actual implementation of these programs, it's very important. And that doesn't just mean having differentiated statistics for female beneficiaries or ethnic beneficiaries. It means having affirmative measures to assure that ethnic and ethnic communities and women can participate in the programs that are necessary. That can include everything from differentiated training processes to child care to specific kinds of culturally appropriate ceremonies and things like that to make people feel welcomed. A good example of where that can be improved is in the crop substitution area, where we have yet to see the implementation of a gender and ethnic approach on paper. There's not yet a protocol for gender and ethnic inclusion, and we have some concerns about how it's being implemented in ethnic communities and with gender groups. So that's one example, but I think we can see kind of a similar trend across many points in the Accord.
That has been very enlightening. Kyle, I wonder if you can tell us more about what can be done about the dissidences. Have they been involved in the killing of social leaders?
I'll answer backwards. So second question first. Yes. That is, for example, when we talked about some of the investigations and the progress from the Attorney General's office, the elite corps of the police, that's one of their findings, that they are involved in the killings of some of the social leaders, without a doubt. The first question about what can be done about them, it has a very simple answer. It's implement the peace agreement. And we argue this for two reasons. One, on a comparative level, when we look at all the countries that PAM, the Peace Accords matrix that the university looks at, we find that when you have a more robust implementation of the peace agreement over time, the likelihood that these dissident groups appear or they strengthen decreases. And the converse is true as well. So if your implementation over time goes poorly, these groups are more likely to appear or more likely to strengthen. In the Colombian case, when we look at what the peace agreement has, the peace agreement is very comprehensive, and so it covers almost all, if the vast majority of the causes and the fuels of Colombia's conflict over time. So as we go forward in the next 5, 10, 15 years, implementing the peace agreement that addresses those issues, it then makes it more difficult for these dissident groups to exist, because the causes will be more and more resolved and the conditions in the countryside for different communities will be better. But the international evidence is clear as day. The more you implement, the weaker these groups become, or it's less likely that they appear in the first place.
Thank you. Yes, and the report 4 has a very important innovation, and is that it also brings together like main findings about comparative peace process implementation. And I would like to ask you, Kyle, if you can expand a little bit of that international perspective that the Kroc Institute brings to the table.
Yes, of course. So one of the comparative findings is the one I just described about dissident groups. We also find that the Colombian Peace Agreement, as I mentioned very quickly, is one of the most comprehensive in the world. In terms of the different policy areas it covers, it's very high up there in terms of complexity, let's say. And the fact that the agreement is almost 90% social reform elements, that simply means that when we look at other agreements that have high levels of social reform or look at social reforms in general, the Colombian agreement will take a lot longer to implement than the average peace agreement throughout the world. A very small part of the Colombian agreement is security-based, and those were done very quickly, as Danielle mentioned, mainly around point 3 and some of the guarantees, like security guarantees issues. But because the Colombian agreement is so comprehensive, the international evidence shows us that it simply will take longer to implement than most other agreements. We also find something very interesting in that support for peace and implementation increases over time if that peace agreement implementation goes well. What's interesting about this is that the starting point for many countries in terms of how their societies see their country after a peace agreement is signed is they often think that the country's in chaos, is an apocalyptic scenario, nothing could be worse than what it is now. But then 5-10 years down the line, as peace is consolidated, as implementation goes well, that vision starts to change, and all of a sudden people have a very much more positive image and understanding of their own country. So that is interesting in Colombia to see, where current polls show that people will have a very negative outlook of things in the country right now. So Colombia kind of fits in the pattern of many other countries right after signing a peace agreement. But in time, if the agreement is implemented well, that will change. And I think those are some of the key findings that we highlight from looking at all the other 30 plus peace agreements that we analyze in PAM.
Excellent. You were mentioning just a few seconds ago some of those reforms, and I have a question here about how actually to speak a bit more about the sustainability component of these reforms, especially with respect to agriculture. Are the historical norms of agroforestry being respected and reinstituted? How?
That's a very difficult question. I think actually many of kind of the key reforms, it depends. I guess it depends on looking at the norms and laws that exist. It's hard to paint a general picture. So when you look at, for example, national parks, the designation of national parks and those laws, that actually creates kind of some hiccups and some difficulties for the agreement, especially if you look at point 4, part of families who are in the crop substitution program but live in areas of national parks haven't been able to really experience or get as much out of the crop substitution program as those who do not live in national parks, and where it's much easier for the state to invest. And the same thing goes for people who live in what they call second law. It would be a rough translation. So areas that are specially protected because they're forests. There are people who live there. And there's 2 categories within that law, which is about where the state can invest and how it can invest and where it cannot. So that also creates some issues and some difficulties for implementing point 1 in those areas as well. But it's those are the main difficulties. I think one of the other ones is that we will see in the future, or is possible we see in the future, is the land registry. So a big question kind of remains of how do you register land in areas where people aren't supposed to be living. At the same time, you have other reforms or other issues that have to do with more with territory than land per se. So the 70 law of 1994 regarding ethnic territories, especially Afro-Colombian communities, those laws, and it's not completely regulated, they still exist. And they're actually addressed somewhat in the peace agreement when you find areas where there are people who are, for example, campesinos who are not Afro-Colombian, but living in Afro-Colombian land. And so those are also issues that the peace agreement kind of looks at and address. But how to maintain their sustainability is a kind of a result of the process. Whatever decision is finally made about how to address these different difficulties because of these different categories, normative or legal categories of land, is where you guarantee some sort of sustainability, at least in the legal sense of the word. And the fact that people can continue to live there and actually benefit from the peace agreement over time. Obviously, there's a financial element to it, but I don't think that was part of the question, so we'll just leave that out for now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. We are at our time. There is one important question that is still running around in my chat, and it's about what has been the role of the international community supporting the implementation of the peace agreement, and what else can the international community do to support that role? Daniel?
Yes, sure. I think that the role of the international community has been key to the implementation of the peace agreement. As we mentioned, the support of the international community, especially in point 3, for example, and point 5, has been crucial in order to be able to successfully implement most of the projects, for example, for economic projects for former combatants, or the implementation of the integral system for transitional justice. So the participation of the international community through the different funds that they have in order to stretch in implementation has been key. This is also relevant if you take in consideration the permanent dialogue that the international community has with the Colombian government in terms of, for example, reviewing our reports to identify what are the different gaps and what are those areas that they can emphasize and they can stretch and based on the findings that we present. So we consider that their role has been key, not just from this financing aspect, but also in terms of political support. They are permanently talking about the importance of the implementation of the peace agreement as an example for the world. So we consider that their commitment to this agreement has been crucial. And there are also areas that they are wanting to progress in the future years. And we have seen this specifically with the COVID crisis, with them emphasizing the support, for example, of the health system at the rural areas in Colombia, which are critical in order to reduce the negative effect of the COVID-19. So yeah, I think that we have also another important aspect, which is having these oversight mechanisms like the international component for the verification of the agreement, which we are part of it. But we have also the UN mission, for example, verifying aspects like reincorporation and also the issue of social leaders. And those mechanisms are crucial according to the comparative analysis that we conduct. We identify that agreements with these international mechanisms tend to be have a more important implementation or higher level of implementation when you have these international mechanisms in place, whereas agreements that doesn't have these mechanisms tend to have less level of implementation.
Thank you. I would like to thank everyone, not just our panelists, but of course the persons that have been participating in the webinar and that have been sending us also many questions via Facebook Live. Our time is up, even a couple of minutes extra. Thank you for your generosity with your time, with your attention. We ask you to please visit our website, peaceaccords.nd.edu. There you will be able to not only download the full text of the report has an annex with all detailed data information. We are also sharing with all of you our videos. We have the videos with the main messages of the report, both in English and in Spanish. We will be uploading the PowerPoints. What we want is to communicate with you. We do this work not only because we like very much to exchange among ourselves in the international and in the academic community, but of course, persons around the world who have gone through the difficulties and the challenges of post-accord implementation. We want us all to learn together from this experience. So if you have any further questions that you would like us to engage with, please do not hesitate to send us an email. We have on our website the email directly of the Peace Accords Matrix, but we also find Colleen Sharkey, who is the person in charge of any questions you might have about the reports in English, and of course, Polly Martinez for any Spanish-related inquiry also that has to do with the media. I wish you all very good afternoon and morning wherever you are around the world, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Bye-bye.